two forms of human trafficking. There is labor trafficking and there's sex trafficking. The Penal Code Statute 236.1 covers both of those forms of trafficking. Sex trafficking is often what we come across more than labor trafficking, and that involves a person that is forced to work in the commercial sex industry, and the victim may be an adult or a minor under 18 years old. And it can happen in various ways. You know, a person might find themselves being trafficked in the commercial sex industry because a young child ended up meeting someone that was older, and they ended up quote unquote falling in love, and this young girl ended up selling her body in order to make money. There are other situations where someone might come to the United States looking for work opportunities and then found themselves being forced to, again, sell their bodies. So these situations come up in various ways. With labor trafficking situations, what's more common that we've seen, and again, these are rarer, they don't come up as often as sex trafficking cases, but we've seen instances of victims being recruited from other countries and being told and being promised to be paid a certain wage, work a certain amount of hours, and then come here, and those promises are not kept, and the conditions of work end up changing. They're not paid what they're owed. There are a lot of myths and lies that are told to them in order to keep them working. So a lot of trafficking situations really center on the trafficker exploiting any weaknesses that a victim may have.
So we're going to give some examples of trafficking right now. I'm going to talk about a labor trafficking case and domestic servitude, and then we'll also talk about sex trafficking and exploitation, and break down the elements showing force, fraud, and coercion. So the first thing that we want to talk about is labor trafficking. So here's an example for labor trafficking. Mary was a young teen. She was 15 or 16 years old, from Peru, and a family friend had offered for her to go work in a Peruvian restaurant in the United States. And it was sold, she was told that she was going to be able to go to school, and then after school, she would work 4 hours a day, and she would earn $10 per hour. So she'd be working roughly 20 hours a week. The reality is when she got there, she was not allowed to leave the house. She was controlled. Her in and out, she had no control over where she could go. She was under constant surveillance, and she was beaten when she actually complained. So that's an element of force. Then there were these false promises. So she was forced to actually sell magazines door to door. She never actually worked in a restaurant, and she did that 4 hours per day on school days. But then she also worked on weekends. She worked 10 hours per day, so 20 hours over the weekend. And that's our element for fraud, the false promises that got her there initially. And then she was threatened with deportation, and she was told that harm was going to come to her and her family if she didn't actually stay and pay off the debt. And her passport actually was confiscated. So we have the coercion, and then by confiscating her passport, there's actually force again. While it's not physical force, they've taken away her identification. So she has no ability or very limited ability to actually leave the situation.
It's about Kevin. Again, we often think of trafficking not within our backyard, not within our realm of people that we know. But Kevin was a young man who had a job but then lost it and was in really financially hard times. Someone came to the door, was selling a magazine, and they got to talking, and Kevin said, I don't have a job, I don't have any money, I'm not sure what to do. And so he was told by this person, oh, do you want to come and work with me? I make lots of money, everything is taken care of. So Kevin was recruited into selling magazines, and he was told that he would get a signing bonus plus great pay. So obviously he took it because he was looking for a job. Eventually what happened is that Kevin got no signing bonus. He and several guys were held in a home, and they were taken every day to go sell the magazines. They had to sell a certain quota. If they did not sell a quota, then they were billed for that. And it took Kevin a long time to extricate himself from this particular trafficking. So here is a young man living in the United States, met hard times, and yet was trafficked.
So an example for domestic servitude would be Nelia, and she was from the Philippines. And a friend actually helped her and her 12-year-old daughter come to the United States. And they promised Nelia that she'd be working and taking care of her friend's son and be working 8 hours a day and making $9 an hour. The reality is when she arrives, her and her daughter arrive, they're forced to sleep on the floor, and Nelia was sexually assaulted by her friend's husband. So there's force. And the promises were actually false, so there's fraud. Nelia received $200 each week, and she was required to work 16 hours a day. So that's the false promises and fraud, because she was initially told she was going to be working 8 hours a day maximum. And then her passport was confiscated when she arrived, and the trafficker told her they would call the police. They would tell them that Nelia had actually stolen something, that the police wouldn't believe her, that she would have to go to jail, and the police would come and take her daughter away from her. So that's the coercion. So that's the elements in terms of domestic servitude.
Many victims of sexual trafficking are children, runaways, or foster children who are taken either via online solicitation or who are actually kidnapped or taken off the streets. Many young people are taken because they want to be models, and they're promised all kinds of possibilities in their life. One example that I find most horrendous is the example of a young boy who in Palo Alto was taken for labor trafficking and knocked on doors and was selling magazines for college. What he really was doing, as he offered a little tiny business card to the woman, is he was available for sex. And he had to continue to do that until he reached his quota and he was a captive. The second example comes from a young woman who was telling me about recruitment of 13-year-olds in the Santa Clara Sports Complex. She was amazed. She lived 2 blocks from this place, and she, who had been well versed in her 4 years of high school on education about trafficking, really was amazed that 2 blocks from her house she found out that 13-year-old girls were going into the Santa Clara Sports Complex and recruiting young women for sex trafficking. The third example is an example right here in Saratoga. When people say, again, it's not in your own backyard, it is. It was a restaurant owner and a nail salon. And the restaurant owner was trafficking 6 persons, 3 from Spain and 3 from the United States. 3 were trafficked for sex and 3 were trafficked for labor. What was most interesting about this example was the fact that the people in the neighborhoods did not know this was happening. The person's survivors were rescued. The people were prosecuted, but many people had frequented both the nail salon and the restaurant and had no idea. Even one of the workers who was not trafficked said, well, the employers treated me well. He was not even aware that these persons were being trafficked.
So even though I actually broke down the different elements in both of the examples of the domestic servitude and the labor trafficking matter, we found force, fraud, and coercion in all of those hypotheticals. The reality is only one is required, only force, fraud, or coercion. And if we're talking about trafficking, sexual exploitation of a child, anybody under the age of 18, then we don't have that requirement of force, fraud, or coercion, because we know that anybody under the age of 18 can't legally consent. Therefore, they cannot be engaging in sexual exploitation. I mean, they can't be willingly be selling themselves. They don't have the agency to be able to do that. So for children that are sex trafficked, the prosecution and the district attorney won't have to show that force, fraud, or coercion. However, unfortunately, the law is flawed in that if you're a child and you're labor trafficked, the prosecutor will still have to show force, fraud, or coercion. Even though you're still a minor, you're still under the age of 18, you still cannot legally engage in contractual in contracts. But the law right now is that if you're a child and you're labor trafficked, the prosecutor will have to show force, fraud, or coercion. But the main point I think I'm trying to make in terms of adults or for children that are labor trafficked is that you don't have to have all three of the elements. You just have to have one of the elements.
So what are the signs of human trafficking? One of them is, of course, a person is very silent, quiet, especially in the labor or when you encounter someone. Someone may show the signs of physical abuse or emotional abuse. There may be bruises and cuts. There may be also signs of anxiety or overwhelming fear or lack of being able to communicate. When persons do not look at you, when people do not engage in conversations, when people are always afraid when they stay with a job and are not free to leave. Many of these are the ways in which you can tell that something is wrong. Suspicious behavior. One of the cases that I have seen and I did report on was a woman and children in front of the post office in my local city, Sunnyvale. And they were there when I went in and when I came out. They seemed very much afraid. The children were not in school. They were there not exactly begging, but anyone who is on a street corner, anyone who is trying to sell something, and they are underage and they are not in school, those can be suspicious signs of human trafficking.
Human trafficking is the illegal transfer of human beings from one place to another. It can be within boundaries of a country or across borders. In Uganda, it happens when you get any human being out of coercion or deceit from one place to another. Mainly the intention is for the trafficker. The victim does not know what is going to happen to him or her. The trafficker knows why you are being taken, either work, for cheap labor, or sexually.
Okay, so now we're going to give an example about a commercially sexually exploited child. We'll refer to her as Jane Doe. And when Jane Doe was 14 years old, she was exploited for the first time. However, the backdrop to that was when she was 9 or 10, she was molested by an uncle, and a couple years later was also sexually assaulted by her mother's boyfriend. When she's 14, she meets an older Romeo pimp who showers her with love and affection, buys her whatever she wants, and says, hey, you've never been to Disneyland. You really deserve a trip to Disneyland. Let's go. All kids should be able to go to Disneyland. So they head out to Southern California, and the reality is they don't make it to Disneyland. He takes her to Orange County and takes her to a hotel room and begins to exploit her. And she is forced to be in the hotel room. She's beaten when she resists. And they're there Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday morning, the boyfriend / exploiter actually leaves for a little bit of time. Tells her, "Don't leave. If you do leave, I'm gonna hunt you down and kill you." And so he does leave. She's frightened. She's horrified. She doesn't want to be there. She actually calls her mother, and she tells her mom, "I don't know what to do. This is what happened." And the mom says, "Well, call 911. Call the police. Get the police there." And so she does that. Jane Doe does call law enforcement, and law enforcement shows up at the hotel room, and they proceed to arrest Jane Doe for prostitution and solicitation. They don't actually go after the trafficker, the exploiter, the pimp. She gets arrested, and she, because she also at that point had a drug addiction, the boyfriend, the Romeo pimp, had actually got her addicted to drugs prior to the exploitation. She ended up being put in a group home a little over 100 miles away from her actual family. And at that point, being isolated from friends and family, she gets exploited again. She's very vulnerable. And something, very similar. They're providing her with drugs. She is exploited for a period of 8 weeks. And then she decides she can't live this life anymore. She self-reports. Law enforcement this time luckily does not arrest her. She actually assists law enforcement with the apprehension of the exploiters, and they subsequently get prosecuted. So because we're talking about a minor child, we're talking about somebody under the age of 18, law enforcement doesn't have to show force, fraud, or coercion for a case like that. But I think that if you review the hypothetical, that you'll actually see there are elements of all of the above.
Here are some examples about human trafficking. One is that of a woman who had a 16-year relationship. Her name was Mari, and the man's name was Daryl. They had gotten married, and earlier in their marriage it was fine. They had 4 kids, but then Daryl started running out of money. And he decided that one way to quickly make money was to begin to sell his wife as a commercial sex person. So he did that. She really did not want to do this, but he threatened the 4 children to harm them. He threatened her, and so she ended up saying yes to this. Then Janice came along, who was 18 years old, and he began, she was living with them, and Daryl began trafficking her also. The way they eventually got out of it was when they were in the car being taken by Daryl to a place where they would be engaged in sex, and the police stopped him. And the policeman noticed that Daryl had their identification, because Mari had wanted to get a driver's license prior, but Daryl had said no and would not let her get one. And he had taken away any kind of identification from her. So the police officer spoke to them privately and was able to get Polaris, which is the United States organization that helps people who are being trafficked, to help both Janice and Mari. Janice was able to leave Daryl immediately and eventually find a job working in a restaurant. Mari left Daryl eventually with her 4 children to another place out of state, but she still struggles very hard and wonders if she should go back to Daryl.
So the last hypothetical we're going to talk about is sex trafficking for an adult, and this fact pattern hypothetical we'll call the survivor Jenny Doe. And Jenny, at a young age, her mother committed suicide. I want to say she was around 10 years old. She ended up being placed in Child Protective Services, and she went from foster home to foster home, where in each home she ended up being sexually assaulted, sexually molested, abused. By the time she's 17, she's a runaway. She's not having any part of the foster care, and she meets an older gentleman who initially offers her shelter, care, food. Relationship forms. There's trauma bonding that goes on. He begins to exploit her. He uses force, fraud, and coercion. And then the recruitment element kicks in, where the exploiter tells her that she has to do recruitment. So she engages, flirts around with a young woman who's 14 years old, and encourages the 14-year-old to have a threesome. It's all arranged by the trafficker. He's, forcing this to happen. She needs to do it or else. And then subsequently, she gets arrested along with her exploiter. The exploiter says it's all her idea. This is something she's been talking about. She's an adult now, and so the prosecution has to show that there was force, fraud, or coercion in that matter. However, she's a criminal as well, and she's being charged. So unfortunately for Jenny Doe, and in this example, while she herself was trafficked, law enforcement isn't necessarily looking at that element. They're looking at the crimes that she's committed directly.
Besides knowing that a person is maybe being trafficked, if you see bruises or any other physical things with that person, the other ways that you can tell is, does a person look at you in the eye? Say that you go to a nail salon, and does that person engage in conversation with you, or does that person look down and not look at you in the eye? So that is one way to begin to tell that maybe that there there's something wrong here. If the person is disheveled, doesn't have proper clothing, that is another way that you can tell. If a person works long hours, that you come into a restaurant, say, and you go there early in the morning, then you come back later at night and that person is still working, that is another way that you can begin to tell. So I think being very observant is probably the best way. You know, when you when somebody comes to your door and is selling something, you know, one of the things that you can do is give them a card and say, if you need help, call this phone number, and it would be the Polaris hotline number.
So I just wanted to say quickly that the fact patterns, the hypotheticals that we are using, they actually are not real cases. They're a compilation of different varying cases, whether they're actual legal cases in a courtroom or hypotheticals from other attorneys that have just been combined. But the one about Jane Doe I think is really important in terms of it takes place in 2014. Currently, we have new law in California as of January 2017 that you cannot charge a minor with prostitution or solicitation. So very excited that we have that law. Many other states are passing very similar laws. And what's really important to keep in mind is that there's no such thing as a child prostitute. So we cannot be charging children with prostitution or solicitation because all we're doing is criminalizing the victims.
While human trafficking can affect anyone, it does, by wide margins, affect the most vulnerable in our society. And that is true across labor trafficking, sex trafficking, domestic, international. Trafficking as a crime disproportionately affects our most vulnerable. Those are displaced people, people who are economically disadvantaged, who don't really have a lot of options. Also people who've already suffered abuse. In America, in child sex trafficking, it disproportionately affects foster children, children of color, lower socioeconomic kind of ranges. And so, and it's also important to point out, it doesn't just affect people overseas. In America, when we're talking about child sex trafficking, we're actually talking about the majority of these children being U.S. citizens who are trafficked. So it does happen all around the world. It does happen here at home, but it very clearly disproportionately affects those who have usually already been exploited or are at a disadvantage.
Not only victims, but society is affected by trafficking. There are companies that send young men and women into neighborhoods to sell subscriptions to magazines, to sell magazines themselves, to say that they are needing money for college and if they will be funded, and to sell food. We pay for these consumable items, and so we contribute to the practice of labor trafficking. Those in affluent neighbors are most susceptible to these incursions of young people coming and asking for some sort of donations.
Besides the victim and the survivor herself or himself, we are all affected. The family is affected, the neighborhood and the community. One example of that is that when we were at a conference not too long ago, one of our young people presented a simulation game where there was a victim in the center of the circle and there was a piece of yarn passed back and forth, and on the outskirts of the center were all the people that were part of this web of trafficking, from the perpetrator to the family to the doctor to the social worker to the faith-based preacher or clergy person. Every single person has an effect on and affected by human trafficking, and so it is considered a very important social problem of today.
Human trafficking affects everybody. It is a vice that is affecting everybody across all boundaries. It does not discriminate whether rich or poor, whether from a rich country or a poor country. For as long as you fall prey to the deceit of the traffickers, anyone can be trafficked. Human trafficking also takes across all sex. It can be a woman or a man, but majorly it is the girl child and the women. Why? Because the girl child is vulnerable, we are looking for a better future, and also these are used as they're taken into commercial sex working. The age of human trafficking in Uganda, for example, anybody between the age of 5, 7, within the country it has been noted. People at home locally use girls at the age of 7, between 7 and 15, as housemaids, what you would call a nanny. This girl is supposed to be at school, but she has been brought to this home as a caretaker of the other little ones. So it starts as early as 7 years and up to around 45 years. Whereas across borders, you find that it is above an age of 18. These are people who are able to go and do extra work in another country, or further still, if it is a lady, she's very capable of being used as a sexual worker.
Sometimes when we talk about trafficking, we don't realize the ripple effects of trafficking on a community. So not only is the victim who is being trafficked, when that person is able to escape from the situation, what happens then is that social services have to come in and really spend time. The person also is in a very traumatic state and has to figure out, with the help of professionals, how to overcome the trauma. And also, many of them have been in a drug situation, have been given drugs or have taken drugs so that they can continue to do what it is that they're doing, which they don't want to do, so they've been numbed. So now you have not only psychological, but also drug effects that have to be taken care of. When that person is reunited with the family or attempts to be reunited, sometimes the family members do not want to take that person back because they are ashamed or they feel that guilty because how did this happen to my daughter, my son, my wife, and so they don't want to take them back. So that then there has to be a whole process within the family structure right there. And within the neighborhood, and then people thinking, oh my goodness, if it happened to this person, could it happen to my children? What can happen? So I think that this whole ripple effect is something that we don't think about when we think about trafficking. And also the economy really suffers greatly because a lot of money is going into social service agencies that could be being used for other things.
Trafficking doesn't only affect the victim. It affects our community at large, and that's why we should all be invested in stopping this crime. When you have someone who is trafficking another person, it's very likely that there's other crimes that are going on. It could lead to domestic violence. It could lead to assault. We've seen cases in a pimping and pandering or sex trafficking situation where a customer, so a person who's buying sex, is robbed of money. So you can see robberies, burglaries, weapons charges. Traffickers sometimes carry guns, weapons with them, knives for protection against customers who are buying sex. So, and then that's on the sex side. With the labor side, we also see employers who are trafficking or who are exploiting their workers, not only failing to pay wages, but then they're also breaking laws in other respects. Workers' comp premium violations, payroll tax violations, and various other fraud-based crimes. So, it doesn't just stop at the crime of trafficking. Trafficking can often cause or be a part of larger criminal schemes.
Most of the victims of human trafficking are women and children. Men and boys are also trafficking, but it's usually 50% more of it is women. Usually it's the ratio. There are 100,000 children are trafficked in the United States each year, and most of the victims trafficked happen to be U.S. citizens. Over 50% to 70%, I've heard, are U.S. citizens. Trafficking will affect every ethnic group, every economic group, every age group. What is sad is that many young people especially teenagers, are affected because of the use of the internet. And many of them are succumbed after a perpetrator may what they call groom them for a whole year before the perpetrator acts upon actually human traffics a person. Runaways, foster children, anyone who comes from a situation that is very abusive or unhappy may end up being a victim of trafficking. Within 48 hours after a young person has run away, a trafficker will have contacted them. And it is, again, very sad and very heartbreaking, but it's something that we can really work on with our young people.
One of the root causes of human trafficking is that there is a lot of a lack of awareness in our community about what human trafficking looks like, how it occurs. You know, there's a lot of myths that a person needs to come from another country in order to be trafficked, or needs to be moved from one place to another, or that this only happens to people who don't speak English or who aren't born in the United States, when in fact that's not true. When we look at the cases that we have prosecuted here in Santa Clara County, we found that in sex trafficking cases, a majority of the victims are U.S. citizens, speak English, often are young, anywhere from 13 years old to their mid-20s. And so this doesn't really fit in the demographics that most people think and kind of you know, assume when it comes to sex trafficking. Now, when it comes to labor trafficking, it's what we've seen is the victims are typically not U.S. citizens, they're undocumented, English is not their first language, and they tend to be older, in their 20s to 30s and 40s. So what we at the District Attorney's Office feel is very important is to go out into the community to educate, to train people, law enforcement, volunteers, so that they are aware of the red flags, the signs, the things to look out for, and also so that they really understand what human trafficking looks like in our county. And what we've seen is that by educating the community and training on the red flags, we've gotten people reporting and giving law enforcement tips on suspicious circumstances, and that's really key in rooting out human trafficking.
Some of the root causes of trafficking are a great lack of awareness that of where trafficking is being done. We often think of trafficking as just happening out of the country, but that is not true. It is happening right here. A young girl can be trafficked by reading an ad that says, "Do you want to be a model?" She says she does, and so she writes in, and eventually she's lured into either the pornographic industry, and oftentimes we think, you know, that these people are held captive, and it's not necessarily the case. But what happens is, like, the young girl who wants to be a model ends up doing pornography, and she doesn't want to continue, but she has been taken either to another city that she doesn't know where she's at. She's not given any money. She has to repay the person who is holding her, who is coercing her, who is forcing her to do these kinds of sex acts. She's being held there because of lack of money, lack of awareness of where she lives, and lack of papers she can't get from one place to another. And she also then becomes indebted to the person, and so she's held there really psychologically.
So why is this happening in the United States? We are a developed country. We are considered, you know, civilized people. Well, we know recently that we are lacking in understanding the human dignity of persons, whether that is African American persons, Latino persons, people of Muslim religion. Anyone who is considered less a person and is treated that way can become a potential victim of human trafficking. So there is exploitation here in the United States for the reasons that we've mentioned before: greed, making money, and not treating people with equality. And whether or not it's in an airport, whether people are treated in terms of screening, whether people are treated poorly in police situations, we know that the United States has a definite problem in terms of treating people equally with human dignity, and that is why trafficking can happen here.
The trade has been going on and has been undercover. People have been deceived to get better jobs, but in actual sense, there are no better jobs. However, someone will say that it is because of poverty, but that is not the reality about human trafficking. Human trafficking is you desire to go and have something better. You are deceived to find a better life elsewhere. Then you fall prey to the traffickers. So I would, and the major cause or the root cause of this vice are the traffickers themselves, because they use a lot of trickery, a lot of deceit, and at times coercion to get the victim to wherever they want him or her to be. So lack of awareness in our communities has led the human trafficking to continue. Even when people are aware, they really feel there is something better for them to do. Like when you go out of your country, for example, to Abu Dhabi, you find a better job, which better job can still be got in a country like Uganda. Another issue I'll talk about is about blaming the victims. You find that we have refugees coming in, and these have been embraced. And the person has been trafficked out of the country, out of their home. When they return back home, they have been blamed for all that has happened to them. Men have been abused sexually, and they're not welcomed back into the community. They are being nicknamed. So it keeps them away from the community. They are not able to, they're not in position to come out and share their ordeal. Maybe through sharing, we could be able to curb the vice. So the lack of the social way of welcoming them back home and handling them has led to the vice being continuous. Another issue is disparities in terms of the women and the men, the gender disparities. You find that the women in Uganda have been vulnerable for quite some time. They don't own property. Whereas they may have access to land, they don't own the property. They don't own the produce from the land that they are tilling. So in the end, they imagine that going and seeking better employment somewhere else maybe would make them better. But in actual sense, it does not do any good. In actual sense, you find that when they go, they are being used as domestic workers in the home with lots of work, or further still as sex workers, which is more demoralizing and causing them more vulnerability.
So another root cause of human trafficking is this belief on the part of the traffickers that trafficking a person is high profit and low risk. And what I mean by that is, you know, a trafficker can make a lot of money selling a young girl or forcing a woman to engage in prostitution and then take all that money. Or an employer can make a lot of money cutting corners and running his or her business and then not pay his employees fair wages. And you know, trafficking is often compared to selling drugs or selling weapons. You know, once you sell a drug, the product is gone, but a person you can sell many times over. So that is a root cause in why trafficking persists. And you know, one of the ways that we're trying to turn that on its head is to hold these traffickers accountable, to say, hey, you know, greed is going to be punished. If you are caught by law enforcement, if you're convicted and we investigate your case and we're able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you're guilty of this crime, the California legislature, our voters have instilled or have created very stiff penalties for human trafficking violators. And so in the past 10 or 12 years, we've seen the prison sentences become much longer for traffickers. So we're hoping that when we're able to prosecute these cases and send out a message that traffickers will be held responsible for their conduct, that equation of high profit, low risk is hopefully no longer becomes a root cause.
Say the barriers to seeking assistance, some of them are pretty obvious, like why doesn't somebody self-report? They're foreign national, they don't speak the language, and they don't have the ability to report what's happening. And maybe they come from a country where you would not trust law enforcement, and so there's not even a consideration to report what's happening here in the United States to law enforcement here. There's a lot of different barriers. I think one of the ones that I see that's really strong, that's pretty consistent with my clients, is the shame and the stigma, whether it's their family or to their elders or the church or the community. Never underestimate that shame and stigma. Even if we're talking about a survivor that's been out of the life for 20 years, that's still a part of their identity. And it's very powerful not to want to disclose and come forward and tell anybody what's happened, or even attempt to get out of the situation, because with all that shame and stigma, they tend to feel there's no hope. And that's exactly what the exploiter wants them to think. And that's how the exploiter is able to manipulate them, is because feeding into that shame and stigma.
One of the things when we talk about the United States and trafficking here in the United States, and why is it happening, there are lots of homeless kids, and those are the ones that are being trafficked. A runaway can be trafficked within the first 12 hours that person has run away. Foster kids are often trafficked, and we do not know that. Foster kids, the social workers, if they don't go to the home on a regular basis, can be being trafficked by their foster parents. So those are two groupings, and usually they are women and children that are being trafficked in those situations. Any area of poverty causes trafficking to happen because there's need of money, and so therefore the children and teenagers are being trafficked. It was interesting that in North Carolina there was a story of a young woman who came from a very affluent family but left her family to go find her way in Nashville and in Charlottesville, not Nashville, Charlottesville, and while there did not have enough money and then became trafficked, and she entered into sex trafficking. So again, someone who leaves a good situation, is trying to make her mark, and then ends up being trafficked.
Well, the root causes of human trafficking or child trafficking in our society are first, poverty. Most of the families are living in the fishing community, and they don't really have all the means to take care of their kids, as many as they are. So yeah, definitely poverty plays a huge role, because they need money to cater for themselves and take care of the kids and other stuff. And also the second factor would be ignorance or naivety, because some of them don't really know that their kids are being sent out on the Lake Volta, where we have most of child trafficking happening. And they probably, after some while through our community engagements, they find out that, oh yeah, I believe my kid is there, and they come and report to us, and we do all that. So yeah, the community is pretty, the Ghanaian community in general is pretty naive about child trafficking or human trafficking. And the third factor, obviously, is the high profit and low risk, because it takes them literally no money to get a kid from a family to the lake. It could take as less as 50 Ghana cedis, which should be something around $10, just to have a kid from their families to the lake, and to work as many years as possible until maybe challenging heights drop in to save the kid. the fourth factor, sorry, should be maybe weak implementation of policies from the government side, whereby we don't do much to take care of that or to cater for the children that are being sold into trafficking. Like the past 2 years, we've been on the Tier 2 watch list, and we were unable to prosecute any slave masters and anything like that. And we have a lucky break. We had a lucky break by staying more into Tier 2 kind of thing, but I should think by the end of this year, if there's nothing that's been done so much, we could have ourselves been withdrawn to a Tier 3 watch list, whereby we lose about $600 million, and that's going to affect the whole Ghanaian economy. So overall, I think those are pretty much the 4 substantial reasons for human trafficking or child trafficking in Ghana.
We all know that gender plays a great role in most areas of life, and there is complete inequality when it comes to the issue of trafficking. Women and children are most vulnerable, and so they are the most victims of trafficking. Gender inequality as a part also of the breakdown of a family. If there is a family tradition where the male is prominent, oftentimes the female, the woman, or the child is also part of an abusive situation. And so, unfortunately, that is the case with at least 50% more women and children are trafficked than boys and men.
There are several causes of trafficking, and trafficking is probably one of the most complex issues happening globally right now, because it plays at this intersection of cultural norms, kind of different stratas of society. It preys on vulnerabilities of different populations. So the root causes are similar but can be different depending on geography and the type of trafficking. But some things that come into play are kind of cultural norms. So if we talk about child sex trafficking in the United States, the fact that in this country we have a population of men who buy sex enables the trafficking of children. Because if that part of our society didn't exist, traffickers would not be able to make money and therefore would not traffic children. So the cultural norms that come into play are very important. If you look at labor trafficking, the fact that as a global society we are constantly looking for lower and lower prices on products and products to be made very quickly. That's corporate pressure, that's stock market pressure. That's meaning that supply chains are constantly looking for the most, often the cheapest labor. Until this is starting to change, but until we as consumers demand that there's more responsibility in those supply chains. Also, kind of the stratification of our society of kind of highly vulnerable populations is one of the root causes as well. So those populations who do not have access or opportunity or options are often very vulnerable to trafficking, and that can be for children or adults in commercial sex in the United States, and that can be people looking for work. So when traffickers go into other countries and make a promise of a job overseas or in another country, they are preying on people who are actively seeking work because they have no other options where they're at. Displacement, so large refugee or migrant populations are at risk as those displaced people are seeking some type of settlement. That also comes into play as a root cause of trafficking. Also, one of it could be a root cause or an issue that makes trafficking worse is, I think, a misunderstanding, especially when it comes to sex trafficking, of who the victim is and what the dynamics are in play in the issue. So
Until recently, often, especially in the United States, children were arrested when they were found in prostitution. That has changed dramatically over the last decade, where now in most states that does not happen, but you still have law enforcement and prosecutors and judges who don't fully understand kind of the mental control that pimps and traffickers have over their victims, and that these children are victims, and that the focus should be put on the demand side so that you can actually disrupt the marketplace. So several different factors at play, a very complicated issue, and that's why it's so important to have so many parts of society, NGOs, government, business involved as part of the solution.
So a third root cause is victim blaming, or the idea that victims don't come forward and report the victimization. And you know, this can be a problem in several respects. One is that when it comes to human trafficking, the act of exploitation itself is illegal. So the act of exploitation, sex trafficking, prostitution, that act is illegal. And so that already is a barrier that keeps victims from coming forward, because they think that if I go to law enforcement, I'm going to get in trouble for engaging in prostitution. The same goes with labor trafficking. If a person is undocumented and working in the United States, that victim won't come forward if they're being taken advantage of, because they think that they'll get in trouble for working in the United States illegally. So what we are trying to do is assure trafficking victims that we're not interested in you know, convicting them of prostitution charges if they're doing this as a result of being trafficked. We're not interested in deporting workers who are being exploited in the United States because they're working here without authorization. We want to reassure these victims that we want to go after their exploiters. And so that comes with education, training, outreach. And that's why it's so vitally important that we do all those things in order to get the message out. You know, another way that this can be a root cause is when the victim comes from, you know, a broken home, or, you know, a low socioeconomic status. A lot of these things are risk factors, and oftentimes we have to look at what is causing a victim to become vulnerable. And this is related, but you know, it's not victim blaming, but it's slightly related to the fact that, you know, a lot of these victims are coming from vulnerable backgrounds and situations, and so we have to address those vulnerabilities if we want to protect them from traffickers.
Another way that our society contributes to trafficking, and we are completely unaware that we're doing this, is the kinds of products we buy. We'll go to a store and something looks really great, and so we go and we purchase it, not knowing that maybe the sweater that we just got was made in a country by little kids who are doing this because they either were sold to the person who is making the clothes, or else that they need to pay back money for their family, and so that's why they're working there. So we need to look to, there are apps that are available where we can check the different kinds of products and whether they're made in a company that deals in a fair way with the people who are employed there. We can also, there's lots of fair trade products that they can go to places, a million stores, I think it's called, a million villages sells fair trade products. So if you just even go on the internet and look for fair trade coffee, and now they have a new thing for diamonds, because we all know that diamonds are oftentimes, they exploit the environment and they exploit the people, but now there is a new industry here in the San Francisco Bay Area that has the technology to create real diamonds without exploiting people or exploiting the environment.
So human trafficking can take place anywhere. You know, a lot of people have this misconception that trafficking only happens in the seedy, you know, places of a city, and, you know, rundown, warehouses or in someone's shady basement. But in reality, it really can happen anywhere. Whether it's a motel that costs $90 a night, or we've even heard of instances of trafficking happening in wealthy communities like Saratoga. And so this really stresses the importance of being able to look for trafficking anywhere and keeping our eyes open, because it can happen any place. I mean, for a long time, I think people didn't think that trafficking was happening in the United States, that it was only happening in third world countries, but it is happening here. And the more and more we do outreach and education to encourage victims to come forward, the more cases we're uncovering.
In Uganda, the major exit route for trafficking is via the Kenyan border, Nairobi. What happens, we have so many companies that are advertising greener pastures in the Arab countries, and you are convinced of getting a better job. So people are selling off their property, plots of land, cattle, name it, and securing money for either the visa or the ticket. So at one point you're handed over to a trafficker via a bus to Nairobi, where you meet the person going to take you abroad. And in this case, you're being deceived. You don't know what is happening. You think there is a better future out there. But in actual sense, when you get to your destination, you're going to be used either as a sexual worker or one for cheap labor.
Trafficking can take place in a lot of different ways. We work specifically on child sex trafficking in the United States, and even within that subset, there are many different ways that trafficking takes place. But one of the most common is that you have people who prey upon our country's most vulnerable children. Children, the majority of whom are coming out of foster care, who have already been sexually abused in their lives, who are coming from a divorced or abusive family. And these kids are seeking someone to take care of them. And the trafficker or the pimp comes along and presumes to take care of them, or the child thinks that, and ultimately kind of wins over their favor and forces the child to engage in commercial sex acts. That is one of the ways trafficking can take place. Another is if a child gets into some type of an abusive relationship, where then they are forced into commercial sex in this country. So it can happen in many different ways. The least likely of which to happen is what you often see glamorized in the movies, where someone is kidnapped and held against their will. That may happen at times, but the reality is that this is really happening through a lot of kind of coercion and mind games with our children who are most vulnerable in this country, who are then exploited because of that vulnerability.
Well, human trafficking is a universal problem. It's not just in developing countries. If you have some time to go on the Global Survey Index website, you can see how far it stretches all over the world. But now in our Ghanaian context, talking specifically about the child labor, which is like 85% of the kind of human trafficking we have in Ghana, we have about 49,000 kids that are working on the Lake Volta. And out of those 49,000 kids, we have 21,000 who are involved in hazardous child labor. So out of those 21,000, also we have boys and girls. And the boys are the ones who do the hard work, mostly like entangling the net, diving, and all that. And the women or the girls are the ones that usually do like house chores and sell stuffs at the market. And when they get to an age where they're old enough, they sometimes get given to other men or other slaves to satisfy their lust and all that. And that's when the sex trafficking aspect comes in on the Lake Volta.
Trafficking occurs through the exploitation of persons who have been threatened or forced, coerced, abducted, recruited, fraudulently recruited into working for somebody, or that the person is owned by somebody else or is empowered, held power over by somebody else. And so, but there's also two areas of trafficking that we often do not hear of, and that is of organ trafficking and also of domestic servitude.
Human trafficking takes place anywhere. It does not discriminate. Anywhere in the community, anywhere in the home, anywhere in the country. For as long as you fall prey to the traffickers, you will be taken. It has no boundary of race, boundary of age, boundary of gender. Anyone who falls prey to the traffickers, they will get you and you will be trafficked.
The 100,000 children are trafficked in the U.S. every year. It is estimated in 2014 that the commercial sex economy in the United States in 8 U.S. cities profited $39.9 million, up to $290 million, and that's just in 8 cities. And a trafficker could earn an average of $32,833. So we know that sex trafficking is a very profitable business in the United States, with United States victims. It is who are mostly women and children, are trafficked for sex in the United States.
So often people ask me how big this problem is, and how big is it in the world, in the state, in Santa Clara County. And that's a really fair question. There are a lot of statistics out there trying to measure this crime, but what I always come back to and what I always think about is that this is an underground industry, and we can identify suspects and defendants that we have investigated and prosecuted in court. I can tell you the number of victims we've identified or how many commercial sex workers we've encountered in our investigations. But at the end of the day, to arrive at a estimate, it's really challenging. And really, the most important thing is any exploitation is too much. One victim is too much, and that's what we really focus on. And this is a crime that we want to address and rid our community of, regardless of what the number is. And there are several risk factors, though, that while anybody is at risk for being trafficked, there are specific risk factors. And like I mentioned earlier, it's prior physical or sexual abuse, coming from a broken home, not having the kind of attention or being neglected by one's parents. Oftentimes we see kids that are in the juvenile justice system or in the dependency system being at risk for human trafficking. And then on the labor side, if you don't speak English, are new to this country, don't really understand how the laws work, you can be at risk for being taken advantage of in the workplace. And so we like to focus on those risk factors and how we can make sure that the populations that are most at risk receive the most support.
According to Polaris Hotline and its report, California has the highest number of reported cases, followed by Texas, then Florida, then New York. In this past year, up until 2016 of December, there were 1,012 cases reported in California alone. And those are just cases that are reported. We know that there are many other cases happening, but these are the ones that have been reported to Polaris.
In Uganda, you find that everyone out of 3 has been trafficked. And the traffickers are very cunning. They get you anywhere, through a friend, through a neighbor, through a company that's been advertised by the government, allowed to advertise by the government. So you find that most of the people right now in Uganda are running out of the country, seeking greener pastures. When you look at human trafficking, it is a trade that is illegal, but having a lot of profits. You find that a trafficker will earn close to a tune of $20.9 billion US in a year. So this trade is illegal, but one of the most profitable ones after drug trafficking. And the people who have been trafficked, for example, I'll give you an example. A woman in Uganda will be bought at US dollars 100, and later on, that is, your whole life has been sold away for $100. And in the end, you are working for $100 every hour. Take an example. If this woman is supposed to work for 8 hours, the trafficker is earning $800 from this woman per day. So each hour is $100. Yet your whole life has been sold away for only $100. So the business is really illegal, and it is calling for a lot of profit for those in the business. I'll give you a case of Karamoja. Karamoja has had a lot of cases of trafficking. Why? Because of the insurgency that happened in Karamoja in the recent past. The communities have been made vulnerable to the extent that they hate staying in their own homes, because what they called home in the past is no longer home. So many of them have come downtown to Kampala, for instance, seeking for better employment. You find that in Uganda, we have so many companies advertising for better jobs and better placement of jobs, especially in the Arab countries. What happens? All the graduates think because we don't have employment in Uganda, we can find a job somewhere else. These have gone ahead to do all it takes, to the extent of selling property, selling houses, selling cattle, selling plots of land to get money for the visa, work on their passports, and they leave the country. So from Kampala, someone is taken straight away to Nairobi or any other exit route, and they are being trafficked. So trafficking has no boundaries. It can get you anywhere. For as long as you fall prey to the traffickers, you'll be a victim to trafficking. I will give you a case of the trafficking that is happening around us, and it is very common. In every homestead in the towns, you find a maid, and this is a modern slave. This is a girl who wakes up so early in the morning and goes to bed so late. She does a lot of work at a meager pay. In all homes, especially in Uganda, we do not have a law that stipulates how much a maid should get. This is a girl or a boy who will be working so hard, getting little, and his or her social being is not being catered for by the home. So you find that this person continues that kind of life, and in the end, some have lost hope. So in case they fall prey to someone who promises them a better job as a housemaid in another country, trust me, they will fall victims to the traffickers.
So you might be wondering how you can fight human trafficking in your community, and I have two suggestions. So the first we talked about earlier. There are a lot of kids, young teenagers, young adults who are at risk because they come from abusive family situations, and I always say that in order to fight trafficking, we need to make victims less vulnerable. So if you have any opportunities to fight child abuse, to fight sexual abuse, fight child homelessness, volunteer at these shelters, encourage parents to be more present and not, be so neglectful of their children. And these are in more extreme situations or circumstances. If there are organizations that help fight child abuse on any level, I think you are fighting human trafficking, because it's less likely that that victim is going to become vulnerable. These traffickers are experts at sniffing out weaknesses and vulnerabilities in victims. So if that victim is missing a father figure, the trafficker will be that father figure. If that victim needs to make money to help support his or her family, that trafficker will use money as a tool for control. So let's help these young people be less vulnerable to traffickers by supporting them and giving them what they may be lacking so that traffickers don't fill that role. Another way that you can help fight trafficking is by looking out for the red flags. if you know, see a classmate or a coworker who, you know, and none of these flags on their own are dispositive, but you know, they might be signs. Victims are sometimes branded with their trafficker's name or moniker, or you know, kind of like a nickname. If they, you know that they don't have a job and all of a sudden are coming with very expensive clothing or bags or shoes, that may be a sign. If they seem they're tired and like they're up all night when they come to school, you know, oftentimes victims are trafficked at nighttime if they are being commercially sexually exploited. You know, these are things just to look out for. There might be some suspicious circumstances that you might see at a restaurant or at a hotel or motel. If in doubt, you know, call the police, call our task force, and we're always there to help.
So are there already existing groups who work on this issue? Yes, many, and it would be important to look into this through the internet. One of them in this Bay Area is the Bay Area Traffic Against Trafficking. In the South Bay Area, there's the South Bay Coalition. But all of these organizations have come together under one umbrella called No Traffic Ahead. And it is an organization of coalition of over 50 agencies who work against this issue. And so you just have to go to the internet and look up No Traffic Ahead.
I think one of the best ways that law enforcement and policymakers can help is to begin themselves to go through some sort of training of what trafficking is, and to begin to change the culture of like the police force. Like I mentioned before, the San Jose police force has done such a good job of treating people not as the criminal, but as victims, and having women from social agencies be with them to you know, when they're being processed, so that the person doesn't continue to feel that they are criminalized for something that they did not intend to do, so that the person realizes that they are a survivor and that they are a victim.
Well, from my experience as a member of the Catholic Network to End Human Trafficking and as a Sister of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, we have taken a strong stance about education about this issue. Probably it is the most important issue, part of ending human trafficking, is to educate many people. What I have done in the past is been giving presentations to various church groups, parish groups, young people, 7th and 8th graders, anyone who does need to know about this issue and how to solve it. I have been especially inspired by high school students who have taken this issue to heart and do research on legislation, who create videos and documentaries and all kinds of social media to reach young people, because they are credible to young people. And so I am both amazed and pleased at my connection with young people who are doing education. We work together to help bring about new knowledge and new information to many groups of people.
The local leaders play a big role in the community, a role of empowering the people, a role of bringing the people together. So the local communities should play a role that if someone has been harmed or being trafficked, to help out and stop the vice. Unfortunately, what happens, we tend to be secretive of our family issues. We are not the Africa, we are not the Uganda that you were before, when the problem at a neighbor's place was a problem at my own home. So such issues come in and it is a secret to the family. So this family have their son, their daughter taken out by the traffickers, and it is not mentioned anywhere. So the community should be vigilant enough to understand where so and so's daughter, so and so's son is working or is residing. So we should have a communal way of tackling the issue. When you come to law enforcement and policies, the government policy on human trafficking is very good. However, it has not been implemented to the full. We have so many companies that have been given license to advertise and take Ugandans out of the country for better jobs. However, whatever happens to them when they cross the country, is nobody's business. Nobody comes up to follow up on why they were taken. So the government should really come up through the Interpol to follow up on why all the Ugandans are working, all that have been trafficked to be brought back home, and also to create a center for rehabilitation of the victims, because they have been traumatized, they have been sexually abused, they have been physically abused, and some actually have everlasting ailments. So we should have a center where they can be rehabilitated and later on brought back to the community. The government is to continue strengthening education. We have the universal primary and the universal secondary education. This is a compulsory education. The more we have our children into the schools, the more we will have them away from such vices as human trafficking. So I would appeal that the government enforces its policies. The policymakers, the parliamentarians, all should come up. We should all come up and have human trafficking kicked out of Uganda.
If you want to donate your time or actual supplies, many shelters and many social agencies that work with survivors need all kinds of equipment, clothing, gift cards, any kind of way to help a person move forward in their life. You can also donate your time. For instance, if you are a doctor, a lawyer, a dentist, you can pro bono work on causes, because many of the survivors, victims, also need expertise in those areas.
The first step in ending trafficking is for everyone to be aware of what it is, so that they can choose where they can best intervene. It is critically important for what we call frontline individuals to be aware of it. Those are people who are in the education system, in law enforcement, in prosecution, the judicial system, legislators, to fully understand the complexity of the issues, so that they understand the impact of the laws and the decisions that they are making in the judicial system. Then, as individuals in society, we can get involved by, one, openly discussing the kind of cultural norms that enable this type of situation, whether that be the kind of acceptance of prostitution in our countries, or the drive for lower and lower costs of our goods that force manufacturers or incentivize manufacturers to make poor decisions and keep their supply chains clean. And once we are aware of what those factors are, getting involved in at a community level to raise awareness and take action where we can. I think it's also important to support survivors of trafficking, because, again, trafficking preys on the most vulnerable, and oftentimes the most vulnerable are those who have already come out of a trafficking situation. So it's a pretty vicious cycle. And then obviously donate and get involved with organizations, both domestically and internationally, that are doing great work on the front lines of this issue.
So what may adults do and community people do on the issue of human trafficking? Well, again, we can influence our legislators, both on the state level, the city level, the state level, and on the national level. We can sign petitions. We can contact our congresspersons. We can use our community power, even at a local level, to pass resolutions on a city level that will say no traffic of persons can happen in this city. So we can use our voice and our power of vote to influence human trafficking.
One of the things, like I said previously, I got involved with this because of the corporate stance of our religious institute on human trafficking, and also my dedication to creating a more just world, even in a very small way. So one of the things I do is I administer a website for the Bay Area Conference of Associates of Religious, and we have a section on the website that deals with social justice issues, and one of the big ones for our religious institutes here in the Bay Area is that of human trafficking. So there are lots of resources that I put on there about human trafficking. So that's one way that I feel that I'm helping to educate people, because education is the biggest way of helping to change the culture. So many people are completely of human trafficking. Recently I met somebody that I know is very much involved in helping other people and trying to make life better for them. And yet when I started talking about trafficking, the person thought that it was only international. She had no clue that it was happening here. So we began to talk about restaurants where she goes and has dinner, and has she checked out to see, you know, who is working there, are they getting a fair wage, nail salons, massage parlors, all of these places where people go. Are they at all engaging the workers and looking at the signs for trafficking and trying to see if, you know, maybe this place people are being trafficked. So I think even in casual conversations we can bring up trafficking, and that is one way of beginning to combat this.
And again, how can we contribute both our talents and our finances to ending this issue of human trafficking? Well, we can support locally and nationally those agencies, domestic violence shelters, community solution shelters, those shelters and organizations that help survivors find a new life. We can also just use, for instance, the money that we spend on one meal, one dinner for one person, anywhere from $20 to $40. We can use that to help a group like Garments USA, which provides backpacks and clothes and other resources for victims of survivors. So we can again use our pocketbook to end human trafficking.
Well, Challenging Heights has a holistic approach to ending trafficking. And by doing so, we have a RRR process, which includes rescue, recovery, and reintegration. And also we do community sensitization, coupled with other programs such as the Youth Empowerment Program and a livelihood program for the women that are unempowered. And that livelihood program is basically called the Women Economic Empowerment Program. And we also promote the realization for every child's right to education. And we also have an advocacy setting whereby we talk about human trafficking locally, nationally, and internationally to bring up awareness and fight trafficking as a whole.
One of the convenient ways of reporting human trafficking situations where a person determines that there is suspicion is the Red Light app, which is available on Android, and also the Stop app is called, and that's available on both Android and iOS systems.
This is one of the very difficult things about human trafficking, is the fact that we tend to blame the person who is being trafficked, and yet it is not their fault. So we need to begin to reverse our thinking on this. It's really great to know that, like, the San Jose Police Department has gone through great efforts, and now when they do arrest someone who is either a prostitute or in a restaurant and is being held for very low wages and maybe undocumented, they do not treat the person as the criminal, but as the victim, and they try to get social services to come and help them. And they also realize that the person may not be ready to let go. They have been under scrutiny, have been trafficked by someone for a very long time, and they're not willing to walk away from something that has been very secure. So let us not stigmatize the persons who are involved, but realize that they are victims of the crime.
If money is a major way traffickers operate, then we as consumers can operate against that by asking ourselves questions. Where do we buy our clothes? Where do we buy our appliances? Where do we buy our cars? And we can ask the questions of these organizations. Who is your distributor? Where do you get your goods? And we can then shop with dignity and shop where places are not using child labor or manual labor of human beings and are victims of trafficking. We can also buy fair trade and ask the question, is this a fair trade product? Where does it come from? And use our money wisely.
So how to stop trafficking, or how do I feel that I'm helping with my anti-trafficking efforts? While working for the Office of Women's Policy in Santa Clara County, doing anti-trafficking policy work, it's definitely trying to help survivors on a systems level, which is completely different than running my nonprofit law firm, where I'm providing direct services, legal services to survivors that have been trafficked. So, in between the different roles, I think when you're looking at a system and trying to make change, obviously there's bureaucracy that you have to deal with. But what's important is you know on the ground what's happening. You're able to take those facts, those cases, and make sure that people in the bureaucracy actually know and understand the impact of what's happening. So that's a great challenge for me, dealing with the bureaucracy and the politics of the job itself, but it's very important work, and I applaud everybody doing policy work. It's really important. Again, with a direct service, it's completely different. It's more based on an individual relationship you have with your client, and that for me seems to be the most impactful. That's where I get inspired, is through my clients, and working with them and helping them find what they feel is justice. And it's may or may not actually be what the court system actually decides, our legal justice system. You might not actually find true justice for a survivor, for a victim in the courtroom. Justice might look something completely different. And so for me, it's definitely much more rewarding when working with my clients one-on-one. I just find that that ability to work with such an amazing individual who's overcome so much. Again, I can't stress enough how inspired I am by my clients and their ability to move forward and to move forward successfully. It's just a delight to be able to work with somebody like that.
So when you see some suspicious behavior, what is it that you can do? Well, the first thing that you can do is report to the Polaris National Hotline. It's 1-888-3737-888. Or you can text Be Free, which is 277-377. These are very successful ways in which to report trafficking. Or you can contact your local police department, which is another number that you can put in your phone, both the hotline number and the text number. What happens to your, this is in the U.S. now, what happens to your call once you've made it? The call then goes to the hotline. They ask you questions. You can remain anonymous. Then they take that information and then they map it to see if other calls have been made from the same area. If there is reason to believe that this is a traffic situation, they will contact the local police authorities, and from there the local police will take care of the incident. By the way, I forget to mention that Polaris is also international, and there is an international hotline number also.
The only way to end trafficking is to address the root cause of trafficking: lack of awareness. Lack of awareness on the rise by the people. So for us at Rido Junior School, what we are doing, we are trying to empower the children that we reach out to, the youth that we reach out to tell them about this rise. The fact that there are people who are into trade, the modern day slavery. So we are trying to make awareness in all the communities where we have been invited, especially talking to the youth and the women. These are the most vulnerable people. So we are also trying to lobby the government to continue supporting, because the government we have a law against trafficking. Once you're prosecuted and found guilty, you serve either 15 years in prison or life imprisonment, depending on the gravity of how the victim has been found. or depending on the evidence that has been brought before court. So we are trying to urge government, we are trying to urge the local leaders, we are trying to urge all civil society organizations to come up and address the price. We are also trying to empower women to get self-reliant, because when someone has a little income in the home, then we are trying to push away the price of trafficking. Otherwise, when they tend to get dependent on their husbands, dependent on their male relatives, then that gives them more chances of being trafficked later on in the future.
What's more important when you get educated about this issue is what do you do with what you know and what you learn. To get trained to help in one of these agencies is very important. Also, I'd like to mention that Stanford University this January, toward the end of the month, is putting out a training course for hotel, restaurant, and the general public. And it will be in small segments, it will be online and free. And so I encourage people to use this to see how they can, first of all, learn more, and how they then can get involved in the local level.
I had mentioned the case in Charlottesville, North Carolina. And one of the things that happened that I was very impressed with is that once this young woman, Joy, had been taken in by the police on a raid in a sex club, the persons who met with her were called Justice Matters, and they're a group of people from a church who make it their business and have volunteers to go with the police to raids such as this, and to sit down with the victim and to try to help that victim during the time that they have been just rescued from their trafficker, their perpetrator. So I think that that is one way that one could, find out what it is that your church is doing, find out organizations in your local area. What are they doing about trafficking, and how can you help?
So how can young people help with this issue? First of all, yes, once they are educated, many young people really want to give direct service to survivors or in social agencies, but that is not possible because of their age. Sometimes there are agencies that want to collect items for survivors, and that's another way young people can collect backpacks and toiletries and things to be given to survivors. That's one element. Another element is to also use legislative advocacy, to learn about an issue and to go to places where politicians are making policy around this issue. For instance, going to Sacramento, California, the state capital, and advocating through various laws that are passed, and they need encouragement from young people to their legislators. Also, some young people actually travel to Washington, D.C., and as a result of their advocacy, various legislation has passed. In fact, this past November, there was reauthorization of funding up to 2020 of $39 million for survivors. So young people can have an impact that way.
So there are a lot of people who are invested in putting a stop to this crime. The South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking, Community Solutions, YWCA, just to name a few nonprofit organizations that have done really good work, grassroots work, bringing volunteers together, putting together trainings and outreach events to educate and do a lot of outreach with respect to trafficking. But the DA's office also too is doing a lot to prevent this crime, to root out this crime. Because not only are we part of the investigative and prosecutorial efforts, but part of my job too is to go out into communities and do outreach and talk to the at-risk communities, particularly with labor trafficking. We're doing a series of Know Your Rights in the Workplace events where we are advising people of what their rights are in the workplace, that they are entitled to fair pay. They're entitled to go into a workplace that is safe, that where they will not suffer any harassment and threats. So we're doing a lot because we know that in order for us to root out more cases, we need to make sure that the community is on our side. And also we're very much a part of developing policies and procedures to ensure that our efforts to fight trafficking are victim-centered, that we're taking into account the trauma that victims experience, that we are taking into account the various challenges that they face. If we take a labor trafficking victim out of an exploitative work situation, the first two things on their minds are likely, will I get deported if they're undocumented, and how will I survive? I may be getting paid less than minimum wage, but it's better than having no job at all. So we make sure that, we give them a safety net. We work closely with immigration attorneys and wage and hour attorneys, community-based organizations to help with shelter, filing T and U visas, which are immigration visas that can allow trafficking victims to stay in the United States legally, and help them get employment attorneys so that they can hopefully get some of their wages back. So we work to ensure that all the needs and concerns are addressed, and putting the victim first above anything else.
A very important role. They receive tips all the time. They spend time investigating these tips, and then they carry out what they consider either raids or releasing victims from their issue of trafficking. One of the things that's important to remember is the attitude of most law enforcement now looks upon victim survivors as that, not as criminals. And they often have an advocate right from the very beginning when they do the interviews with someone who has been recently rescued from a trafficking situation. Legislators are also important to involve in understanding this issue, and they use their expertise to continue to advocate through new laws to protect the victim as well as to prosecute the perpetrator.
So, as a young person, there might be some restrictions on what young people can do to help fight trafficking. A youth can't necessarily volunteer at a trafficking shelter or homeless shelter or abuse shelter like adults can, but what young people can do is look out for the signs, take the information that you've learned and help educate other adults, other people in your community, and frankly just having these conversations and talking about trafficking and that it exists in our community goes a long way in the fight.
Another way young people can create an absolutely wonderful, credible resource is in the area of social media. I've had students work with me with 7th and 8th graders on the perils of social media, on how to use social media to pass on good information, but also how they can protect themselves from the misuse of social media. So that is one area where young people have the expertise, the knowledge, and the connections, and can make a great deal of difference in the lives of other young people.